Hey there. Welcome to Reading the Bible. My name is Collin. I'm the lead pastor at Redeemer Anglican Church. And in this season of the coronavirus keeping many of us in our homes, I want to help you and your family learn to love reading the Bible. I think a lot of us don't necessarily know how to approach reading the Bible. It's this strange and thousand-year-old book. And even though people like me are constantly telling you that you should be reading it with your families in your homes, when you do open it, you don't really get anything out of it. And if that is you, I want you to know that you're not alone. And I would love to come alongside you and help you. Because yes, it is a strange book written thousands of years ago, but I have come to believe that it is the most transformative work of literature that this world has ever known. And I want to help you discover that as well. So last week we looked at the main storyline of the Bible, and we saw that each book is contributing to the epic, overarching narrative in its own way. Because anyone who has ever tried to read the Bible knows that it's not laid out like any normal, modern, contemporary book. Because the Bible is made up of many different books, written by different authors, for different audiences, and at different times. And the way that these books and their particular genre of literature contribute to that main storyline, that's what we're going to be exploring over the next few weeks. And we're going to be tackling the three big genres of the Bible. We've got narrative, poetry, and discourse. And this week we're exploring narrative. What's crazy is that a lot of us have this idea in our minds that the Bible is like a manual or a textbook for how to live. And so we'd expect then the Bible to be filled with moral teaching or lists of what to do and what not to do. But actually, the vast majority of the Bible does not include any of those things. In fact, the majority of the Bible is filled with stories. 43% of the pages of your Bible is narrative. Another 33% is poetry, and actually only about 24% is what we would call discourse or instructive teaching. That means that almost half of your Bible is story. And so if we're going to learn how to read the Bible, we're going to have to get a handle on how to read biblical narratives. And that's what this week is all about. So let's get into it. So we said in the first episode that stories have the power to shape our sense of ourselves, our identity, and also our understanding of the world. And that's because actually our brains are built to process information through a narrative. Neurobiology will tell you that the majority of our experiences, our knowledge, and our thinking is organized by a set of stories. My wife can't fathom why on earth I like chocolate-covered raisins. And when I try to explain that particular taste, I revert to telling her a story. How me and my dad used to enjoy them when we go see movies at the theater. Suppose someone were to ask you for a restaurant recommendation. I'm betting that in your answer, you're going to revert in some way to a story. Either you or someone you know has gone to that restaurant and found it to be good, worthwhile to recommend. Story is the basic principle for how our brains organize information, because it's through stories that we make sense of all the disparate events of our life. So then it's no surprise that the main way that the Bible is going to speak to you is through story. Both that overarching story that we looked at last week, but also those smaller narratives that contribute to the main storyline. Who are we? What are we here for? What's wrong with the world? How is it going to get better? All of these important questions are presented and answered in the Bible through the use of narrative. So how then should we read the stories that we find in the Bible? Well, we don't possibly have enough time to really cover the totality of that topic, so I just want to offer a good starting place. Let's simplify it and ask first, what is a narrative? At its most basic, a narrative we have a character who faces a challenge that he or she must overcome or resolve in some way. And so you think about some biblical stories. David, opposed by Goliath, has to find a way to defeat him. Joseph, confronted with his brother's betrayal, has to find a way to deal with them or to go on living, to survive, really. Moses, at the edge of the Red Sea, has to find a way to escape Pharaoh's armies. So when you're reading these narratives, and this is so important, you have to read every scene as part of the larger story that they reside in, as part of a larger context. Because if you lose sight of where a particular scene fits into the wider plot, you're going to make the story have a message that is something totally different than what the Bible intends for you to get. And at that point, you're no longer actually reading the Bible, you're reading into the Bible. So Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart do a great job of illustrating this idea of reading in context in their excellent book on how to read the Bible, called How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. It's appropriately named for us, right? So they take the story of Gideon, and they show how reading a scene of that story out of context will completely change the message that you get from the story. So there's a scene in the story of Gideon where Gideon is trying to discern if God is going to help him win a battle. And so he asks for a sign from God. He lays out a wool fleece overnight, and he asks that God would make the wool fleece wet with dew, but the ground around it completely dry. And we see that God, he does it. He grants that request. So if we are looking at this story in isolation, the conflict of the story is how can Gideon know whether he can trust God? And then the resolution of the story would be to test God and to find out. But we only get that meaning, that message, if we take this story out of its context, because that's not at all what this story is about. But we're only going to get the message if we read it in its overarching context. So we see in the beginning of the story of Gideon, we have Gideon and his community, and they're living in fear because they're being oppressed by a violent group known as the Midianites. And so they call out to God, and God in response chooses Gideon to send him to go and defeat the Midianites with the Lord's help. But we find that Gideon is scared. He's nervous. He's very hesitant. And so he asks God for a sign to know that it's really the Lord who is speaking to him. And God accepts that request, and he taps this altar with his staff, and it just bursts up into flames. Poof! So now we know, as we're reading now in context, we know that Gideon has already asked for a sign before the whole wool fleece episode even begins. But the story then goes on. We learn that God then tells Gideon to go and to destroy a pagan altar that is to another god. And Gideon goes and he does it. But Gideon does it at night because Gideon is so afraid. He doesn't want anyone to see him. So he's so afraid he goes and destroys it at night so he can do it under cover of darkness. So now we're beginning to understand a little bit more about who Gideon is and what conflict we're actually facing. So now we come to the eve of this great battle with the Midianites. And again, Gideon, he gets cold feet. And that is when we have this episode with the wool fleece. He asks God for another sign. And we see God accepts and he grants that request. But Gideon is still not convinced, and he asks for another sign involving this very same piece of wool fleece. And again, God accepts that request, and he shows him that sign. So, with that wider storyline in place, we can see that the conflict in this story is not how can Gideon know that he can trust God. God has been abundantly clear throughout this entire storyline. He's been giving Gideon sign after sign to convince and persuade him that God is with him, that God will do battle on his behalf. So the conflict of this story that we see now in the wider context is really, will Gideon ever trust God? Like, will he ever get his act together and actually trust the God who is constantly showing him sign after sign? So the story goes on. Gideon gathers together some 30,000 people to fight the Midianites. But now God, he begins to dwindle that force down all the way to just 300 soldiers. It's funny, Gideon had been testing God, and now God, we see, is testing Gideon. And the conflict is there. When will Gideon trust God? Will it be now? But it gets even more ridiculous for Gideon, because then God tells him to arm the 300 soldiers not with spears and swords, but with jars and trumpets and torches. And he tells them to go up on a hillside to surround the Midianite camp with these instrument and torch bearing soldiers, and to just make a bunch of noise and smash the jars together and blow on their trumpets, and to do it all on this hilltop at night. And so they do it. Gideon does it. And what they find is that the Midianites have this giant panic arise within their camp, and they begin to destroy one another. And so the story ends with Gideon and his forces from the safety of this hilltop watching as the Lord destroys the Midianite oppressors right in front of them. So with all of that, when we read that little story as part of this wider story, we can see that it's not about giving people tips for how we can trust God, how we can discern God's will. But rather, this is a story about God's commitment to use weak and cowardly and deeply flawed people to do more than they could ever imagine. So, when we are reading, then, a story in the Bible, we have to be constantly asking ourselves a question. How does this fit into the wider context of the narrative plot? Because what you'll begin to see then is that the entire story of Gideon, the whole Gideon saga with its plot line, actually fits into a wider story. Because it resides in a book known as Judges. And Judges has its own narrative arc that Gideon is a part of. But then we go a step further out, because the book of Judges with its narrative arc is actually a scene that fits into the wider storyline of Israel. And Israel has its own narrative arc that the story of Judges is a part of. And then it goes even farther out, right? Because the story of Israel with its narrative arc is part of a wider story of the entire Bible. And the Bible has its own narrative arc that the story of Israel is a part of. Now, I know that probably sounds overwhelming, but you don't have to make all of those connections at once. But what I want you to see is that when you are reading these small stories in their wider context, you're training your mind to recognize that there is a unified story throughout the Bible. And if our purpose is to get something out of the Bible, we have to find out how is what I'm reading connected to that great story. And the only way that you can do that is if you read it in context. So friends, that is all we have for this week, but we're not done looking at narratives yet because it's such a large part of the Bible. Next week, we're going to be looking at the fascinating way that the biblical authors use characters and how they use characters and characterization in a way that's different than what modern authors do. And so it's going to be a blast getting to look at that with you guys next week. If you want to connect with me, ask any questions, if you want to connect with Redeemer Anglican Church, be sure and follow us on our Facebook page or our website. Send us a message. Let us know how you're reading the Bible. How is your reading of the Bible improving? What challenges are you having? We would love to dialogue with you in some way. And as always, may God bless you as you open His Word this week, and we'll see you back next week.